Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right, welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Natural Resources, and I have my co-host today, Nathan Pfluger with Pheasants Forever. Nate, you want to introduce yourself a little and talk about an episode today?
Absolutely. Nate Pfluger here, and today we are actually going to be talking about carbon and carbon supply chains with a couple of TNC folks. We got Gabriella Scolio and Jacob Penner with us. And the reason that I wanted to kind of explore this idea of carbon and carbon supply chains a little more is that when I'm working on the landscape with producers in a row crop setting, a lot of them are asking me about carbon. Well, are there any companies out there where it's going to benefit me to sign a contract with them? Can I get paid for this? What practices can I get paid for? How much can I get paid? And to be completely honest, all I've really heard up to this point is that carbon's kind of the Wild West. So hopefully here we have some experts that can kind of shed some light on it for us and clear things up a bit. So with that, Gabrielle and Jacob, please introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Great. I can kick us off. Super excited to be here. My name is Gabriella Scolio. I work at the Nature Conservancy. I'm an agriculture decarbonization specialist. So I do spend a lot of my time in row crop systems, also a little bit in forestry systems, working with large food and beverage companies on their decarbonization strategies. So that's all the way from implementation of different practices in field on farms through, and then all the way through the supply chain, thinking about how can we account for those benefits? Where should companies be focusing their time and money? I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and I will kick it over to my awesome colleague, Jacob.
Yeah, great to be with you all today. I'm Jacob Penner. I am also with the Nature Conservancy. My title is Agriculture Carbon Specialist, and I support any of our carbon projects that TNC works to develop. We have a growing portfolio of carbon projects around the world in all sorts of different fields. Agriculture is interpreted pretty broadly, so it includes anything from row crop systems to the grassland and grazing systems. So yeah, excited to be here today and talk more about what we do, TNC's perspective on carbon in general. I'm based in Lawrence, Kansas, so we're sort of all fairly close in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, awesome.
So really quick, how did you guys even become interested in carbon, right, within the ag system? Because, I mean, really it's relatively new in the grand scheme of things, right?
That's a great question. For me, I did my graduate work at Colorado State University up in Fort Collins, which is a land-grant university, and they've been doing the agriculture portion of the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory since we started doing that in the United States. So I have always had an interest in agriculture, an interest in working lands, and really wanted to find a way to put that into practice. I also think companies are a really important piece of this puzzle. So thinking about just the intersection of science, markets, companies, climate change, it seemed like a really natural place to start my work. I've been with TNC only for about 2 years. And as you've mentioned, yeah, this is like a relatively new space, but it's also a space where we've seen a lot of dynamic changes and it's definitely not going anywhere. So I definitely feel like we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, similar to Gabriella, my interests have always been sort of in grasslands and working lands. And I did a graduate degree at Syracuse University in New York, but there's a fieldwork component that was out west in Yellowstone National Park. And so from there, graduating and looking for jobs, the jobs that were available, strangely enough, were in some of these carbon spaces and with carbon developers. And so I didn't really know anything about that before the time, but a lot of these skills and sort of scientific understanding of how ecosystems work, how working lands work, lend themselves to this emerging carbon market where you're really trying to sort of figure out ways to leverage those systems and tap into this new market and this new demand that exists for carbon as a commodity, the same way working lands already produce so many other commodities.
That's really cool. That's awesome. So I'm thinking about TNC's role and kind of how they're fitting into that carbon picture. So how, you guys talked a little bit about your guys' background. So how has kind of TNC gotten involved in that area, and kind of what are some of those emerging things that, with that involvement that TNC has had that you guys are excited about, and, part of your roles that you're actually doing each day. So.
Yeah, maybe before we jump into that, it would just be helpful to give a little bit of history on the Nature Conservancy.
Sure, that'd be great.
Also call it TNC. I often call it that, and no one knows.
Yeah, good.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, that's good.
TNC equals the Nature Conservancy. So I think it's really helpful to understand the history of the Nature Conservancy. So we were founded in the 1950s. As more of an organization really focused on protection and preservation. So TNC was founded by a group of ecologists in upstate New York who essentially put second mortgages on their homes to purchase a really important section of forest. And through that, it's always really been a grassroots organization. So it kind of grew organically in the United States as a land protection organization, as a conservation organization. So right now we have the Nature Conservancy chapters in all 50 U.S. states.
Wow.
We also have chapters in country programs in I think upwards of 70 different countries outside of the United States. Wow. And are often called like the largest conservation organization or environmental nonprofit in the world. I also bring up the state chapter piece just because of each of TNC's state chapters kind of has its own remit and fits into a broader like global TNC. But that really allows the chapters to focus on what's ecologically important, what's really important in the places that they live and work. And then I think another thing I wanted to mention was the agriculture component. So I think now it's really obvious how working lands fit into conservation, but back going into like the 1950s, we're thinking about just like traditional land protection. So just in the past 20 to 30 years, TNC has really focused on agriculture, on working forests, and on grasslands, like Jacob and I have mentioned. And we've seen that really proliferate throughout the organization. Now, a lot of the state chapters have actually specific agriculture programs. I think both of you knew Hannah when she was the director of the program. So we found that as like a really successful way to kind of design our implementation around agriculture. And that all ladders up into like a larger focus at the North America level on agriculture. So we actually have a strategy that both Jacob and I are really aligned with that is focused on agriculture. So I think that's just important, like context setting, how we've evolved. And I think, everyone has really different experiences with TNC. Some people it's like outside of the grocery store being asked to donate. Some people it's like at local meetings. Some people it's, you're just listening to podcasts like this. So I think it's always helpful to do a little bit of ground setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And as far as TNC's history with carbon and climate more specifically, that's something that's only really existed for the past 20 years or so, and which is longer than Gabriella and I have been here. But initially, that work was a bit more sort of patchy. Different chapters doing their own work sort of independently. And what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is really sort of like a consolidation and a more strategic focus on a lot of carbon and climate related initiatives. And so that work has included things like a lot of scientific research on how conservation can help address climate change, partnerships with companies and countries to assess and actually reduce their carbon emissions, and then on the ground carbon projects where we're actually implementing climate friendly conservation practices and using carbon markets and other similar tools to finance them. So the work has gotten a lot more, I'd say, intentional and focused in the last couple of years. There was a paper that TNC put out in 2017 that sort of set the groundwork for a lot of that work by introducing this concept of a natural climate solution, which is maybe something we can talk a bit more about.
Yeah.
Well, so it sounds like you guys do a little bit of everything. You brought up research, which obviously is extremely important in this area. Number one, because it takes a long time to get quality research, but then you're also interfacing with the companies and growers as well. So there's a lot going on there at all across the levels.
Yeah, there is. And, there's a lot of people doing that work. And so Gabriella and I own just a very small piece of it. But yeah, it's a lot of exciting work, a lot of different teams. TNC is a very matrixed organization, as we like to say. And so lots of different programs doing lots of different things. It's challenging to keep track of sometimes, in all honesty, but exciting nonetheless.
Absolutely, I bet. So when it comes to the research side of things, are you actually doing on-farm type research, or do you have other projects that really where growers aren't involved with, or where are you getting your data from?
Yeah, it depends. I think there's some projects where TNC works with farmers on the ground to collect data from their operations and understand the climate impacts of the different practices that they're doing. There's a lot of sort of broader scale research, I'd say, as well. So I talked about this idea of natural climate solutions, NCS, as we like to abbreviate it, and that's sort of really been a key framing for TNC in a lot of the work that we do. And so the research there is really to just sort of understand and categorize these different ways in which nature and conservation can be used to address climate change. And so, we came up with sort of these different classifications, these actions that you can take to protect landscapes and store carbon that way. You can improve management in lands and store carbon that way. You can restore landscapes and store carbon that way. So there's this sort of whole different library and language of practices that TNC has sort of really helped to sort of put out there into the mainstream. And that builds upon a lot of the work that's been done in academic circles for a long time. We've supplemented it with some of our own work and projects in partnership with producers on the ground. But it's that sort of high level framing and a lot of global studies to say if we're able to do regenerative agriculture on 10 million acres, how far is that going to move the needle in the fight against climate change, for example?
Sure. That's really cool.
Yeah, so we've said carbon probably, I'd say no less than 200 times already. Can we can just briefly describe what carbon is and then move on to why it's important for producers, companies, and then just the general public?
Yeah. So carbon, of course, it's an element, the periodic table. It's the foundation of all life. But in this case, when we talk about it today, I think we're sort of using it as a catch-all term for greenhouse gas emissions, which matters, especially in the ag space, because different practices, different farming operations will have different impacts on different greenhouse gases. So carbon can include everything from soil carbon. It can include the carbon that's stored in woody plants, trees, and shrubs. It can include methane or nitrous oxide that comes along with rice irrigation, for example, or fertilizer application. So carbon is a very broad catch-all term. It's sort of the common currency of carbon markets is a molecule of carbon dioxide. And so when we talk about carbon markets, what we're talking about is trading of carbon dioxide and accounting of carbon dioxide that represents sort of that all of those other emissions are converted to. Soil carbon is maybe sort of one of the areas where folks are most interested and hear the most about, especially in this part of the world. And soil carbon's special because it represents carbon both that's not in the atmosphere and so not contributing to climate change, but also contributing as a key component of soil health. And so we know from a well-established body of research that soils that have more carbon also hold more water. They are more productive for crops and grazing lands, and they support more life in general. So it's a good thing for the climate to have carbon in the soil, and it's a good thing for so much else to have carbon in the soil.
That's really good. Yeah, and so from a producer kind of landowner perspective, it sounds like obviously from, thinking about that producer, thinking about the soil component you just talked about, it's pretty valuable for them. And so as the experiences you guys have had working with various companies, what are the, what are the interests from the companies? Why are they interested? And then obviously kind of on the other side of it, from that producer angle as well, like what are some of the things that people are saying to you guys that kind of is driving them towards that carbon market?
To start out, when we talk about the carbon market and then when we talk about companies decarbonizing their supply chain, there's definitely some overlap there, but companies are also able to take actions like the natural climate solutions that Jacob just finished describing within their supply chain. And the outcome of that is not always a carbon credit. They're not always looking to develop a carbon credit and sell that on the marketplace. I think right now, when you talk to producers, they're most familiar with talking about carbon from a carbon market perspective. But now we've seen in the past 5 to 10 years, large food and beverage companies, large forestry companies throughout the agri-food supply chain set climate targets. So they're looking to not only purchase carbon credits that happen outside of their supply chain, but they're also looking to decarbonize their supply chain. So that would mean working directly with growers that they know are in their supply chain, talking to them about what's working on your operation, what type of data are you already collecting, how can we quantify emissions that are happening on farm, and then how can we incentivize further action. I think on the company side, where we're seeing the interest in carbon, I would also say we generally use kind of the same framing, like carbon is this catch-all term, but you'll hear companies talk about their greenhouse gas inventories and greenhouse gases generally. So we can use carbon as this catch-all term, but know that it means other things. We're seeing this interest because they've set these climate commitments. There's also some regulatory context. So when you're thinking about large multinational companies, they're having to pay attention to regulation that's happening in the European Union, for example, that's going to have them report on how many emissions they're generating with their supply chains, with their own operations, and with the electricity that they're producing. So I think in the past 10 to 20 years, we've definitely seen an increase in companies starting to think about this. And carbon markets is one way to do it. Within supply chain action is another way to do it. I would say on the company side, it's a lot less concrete. It's a lot less clear. We have a lot less proof points than carbon markets. So it's definitely an emergent space. And I think this is a common theme that'll come up. There's just a lot of language around all of this. So when we talk about decarbonization, when we talk about net zero, when we talk about carbon markets and a carbon credit, there's just a ton of language, and it sometimes means different things to different people.
That's cool.
And I would just add to that, I think another major reason that a lot of companies are interested in doing something here is that, they see and acknowledge that runaway climate change poses a huge risk to the way that they do business. And so, in a world with more frequent floods, more frequent droughts, excessive heat waves, their supply chains and the commodity base that they rely on and source from is more at risk. And so this sort of focus on decarbonization and on investments into supply chain resilience and supply chain sustainability really sort of, them protecting their core interests, which is just, their supply chain and the area that they draw from. So there's interest in, using carbon and the markets that have sprung up around carbon to make money, certainly. But then there's also that interest in protecting your own supply chain and investing in its resilience in the face of expected future climate change.
Sure.
And I think one of the main roles we've played as TNC when we think about supply chain resilience is helping companies really understand the local context of where they're procuring from.
Sure.
I would say if you think about a large multinational company, the job of their procurement team is to procure what they're looking for at the cheapest price possible. And
Sure.
a lot of kind of the top top level advisory that we've done with companies is like, how do you think about your supply chain resilience? How do you build that into your procurement strategy? So we're not just seeing that when we have these large flooding events, when we have the impacts of climate change affecting supply chains, we don't just see these large companies just switching to a cheaper supply chain, and that's how they're kind of solving for that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, without a doubt. So you briefly mentioned regulations, and that was more in the EU. Does it seem like here within the US, it's more that consumers are pushing for change? Or maybe, like you said, it's really just those companies thinking like, hey, we got to do something different because all these natural disasters are causing us problems in the long run?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate characterization. It's in the United States, we definitely see like your social license to operate as a company. So thinking of if consumers perceive your company as like doing harm to the environment, where there's definitely some initial studies saying they're less likely to purchase items. We definitely don't have any comprehensive regulatory legislation like in the European Union. I would say California is a good example. They have some pending legislation on getting companies to think about disclosing their emissions, but we definitely don't have anything as comprehensive. There's also a Security Exchange Commission kind of piece of regulation that may come into effect that's thinking about asking companies to disclose their emissions. But no, we definitely don't have kind of an enforcing mechanism at the regulatory level in the United States that's forcing companies to reduce their emissions right now. It's all really based on kind of global, like the Paris Climate Agreement and this like new EU regulation. But Jacob, I know your team thinks a lot about this too, so feel free to jump in.
I mean, I think you said it well, Gabriella. It's most of the regulation exists outside of the U.S., with the exception of a few states like California. But I think also what we see is that a lot of the companies that are most interested in purchasing and investing in carbon and supply chain decarbonization are these like much bigger global companies, and so they're more responsive to that regulatory landscape. And a lot of different initiatives that sort of popped up in international scale to do that sort of thing. One example I can think of is a scheme that's called CORSIA. It's an acronym that I don't remember honestly, but it's basically sort of a requirement for the aviation industry to invest in decarbonization and offset the emissions from international flights through the purchase of carbon credits. And so that's sort of a big mechanism that exists to drive some of the demand that we see in the carbon landscape.
And I think that's a good segue into just kind of taking it down to more of a field level, I'll say, because you mentioned carbon credit. So what is a carbon credit? And then we can move on from there.
Yeah. So fundamentally, a carbon credit is a certificate that basically says that somebody took some action somewhere that resulted in the reduction or the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. It's an invisible asset. It's an invisible commodity, but it's the sort of core product and core unit of the carbon market. And so it can be bought, sold, and traded by anyone who wants to participate in that market. The key fungible unit is a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll see CO2e is sort of how that gets abbreviated and used. So that's what a carbon credit is. It has to be that intentional human action. That's sort of a key piece of it. And there's a lot of rules and standards that exist around how you generate that and how you verify it, because it is an invisible asset. There's this whole sort of infrastructure that needs to be in place to verify and confirm that action has happened and that impact has happened. But yeah, at its fundamental unit, it's the human activity that took carbon out of the atmosphere, or avoided an emission of carbon into the atmosphere.
So is there a lifespan on a carbon credit? Because you mentioned they could be bought and sold. So, I mean, how many times can a carbon credit be sold?
Yeah. So each credit is, when it is generated, when it's issued, it's stamped with the year that it was generated in. So If you're in a carbon program and you planted a cover crop in 2023, then your carbon credit from that year will have that stamp associated with it. It can be bought and sold as many times as you want. But what happens is that each carbon credit is issued and approved by a carbon standard. And so these are groups, mostly nonprofits, that run these, that set the rules for how a carbon credit is generated and then actually do the work of sort of verifying they've been issued. And so they also have registries where they track the sale of these credits. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the final purchaser of a carbon credit will choose to retire it, is sort of the language that we use. And so at that point, that's noted on these registries. Only one entity or one company can retire a carbon credit. Otherwise, you have sort of two people claiming the same impact. And so that's the key sort of piece of the traceability and the trust that the market needs to have. But yeah, it can be traded for as long as there's demand for it. What we do typically see is that credits that are older tend to have a lower value, and so more recent credits will be traded at a higher value and then usually retired by the end user.
That's interesting. So this is just kind of actually going back to some of the earlier discussion, but I think it's an interesting question. What are some of the misconceptions kind of around and we'll specifically stay on carbon credits, and kind of talking about you mentioned it's this is an evolving thing, that it's still kind of you mentioned it's like you said it's an invisible thing you're trading in a sense. So it's like how is that kind of going into your guys' conversations and engaging with not only landowners but companies around any potential misconceptions that are maybe out there? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think one common misconception is that when we're talking about carbon credits, and maybe this is an accurate characterization, is that companies or purchasers of carbon credits are only interested in the carbon. I think the fungibility that Jacob mentioned of a carbon credit really lends itself well to developing accounting systems and creating this traceability system that we can track, and when an action happens, we can ensure that it happens and it continues to happen into the future. I would say that we as an organization don't only care about carbon, and I would often say that the purchasers or generators of carbon credits aren't only caring about carbon. Like Jacob mentioned, it's a really good proxy for understanding soil health. It's just often the entry point that we find is easiest to talk to companies, talk to purchasers of carbon credits. So I just know that we're spending most of our time talking about carbon, but there are other co-benefits when we talk about implementation of these practices that we are thinking about measuring and including as outcomes in these types of projects.
That's cool.
One of the myths that I was thinking of here is, I don't know if myth is really the right word, but we see a lot of perspective and criticism that carbon credits are a license to pollute, essentially. That if you buy one, you can, if you're a company, you can emit an emission somewhere else. And with, that's been a persistent complaint and criticism of carbon markets for a long time. Our perspective as Nature Conservancy is that, the standards that are in place really make that not really a fair criticism. So the purchase of carbon credits can be used for any sort of purpose, not necessarily just to offset emissions. And the emerging sort of standards and rules are really pushing companies to reduce their own emissions and also purchase carbon credits and invest in supply chain resilience, like Gabriella has been talking about. And the fact of the matter is that carbon credits are really sort of one of the cheaper ways that companies can reduce their emissions in the grand scheme of things at this point right now. And so what we really push for as the Nature Conservancy is all of the solutions that we have to climate change at once. And so, yes, we want companies to be working to decarbonize their supply chains to reduce their own emissions. And then for the pieces that they cannot reduce, we want them to be investing in carbon projects and carbon credits that can help sort of go that much further. because, climate change is a crisis, and it requires all hands on deck and all the solutions that we have, basically.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I just thinking about, with, as a, kind of talking and engaging with landowners. I know you both mentioned, obviously you work a lot, with companies. What are some of those conversations? And kind of, again, I think it's so new. I've heard a lot of conversation, even just here in Nebraska. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty from a producer standpoint. And that's where a lot of our podcast is reaching out to landowners. And I guess just kind of from your guys' perspective, what is TNC and kind of your guys' role, and maybe kind of giving them some more certainty and kind of a path forward on what does that look like into the future? Because I know there's just a lot of questions that I know Nathan probably gets as well from landowners out there. Just it seems so new and novel, and it's like, well, kind of where do I even start having some conversations around this? So.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the sort of larger market context and why this exists, and why companies are interested in it, why there's money available for something called carbon. Like, who cares about it at the end of the day? So, I like to start there. To some extent, it is a very new way to bring value to a farm, to a landowner, and so. There are examples of projects that have been done well and that everybody's been happy about. And there's been plenty of examples of projects that, a couple of years in, somebody maybe regrets signing up for. So, Wild West is a fair term to some extent. And I think that's, part of what we try to do as the Nature Conservancy is really push and advocate for a shared understanding of these sort of core principles of the right way to do a carbon project, of the right way to engage in carbon credits, and sort of what that looks like, both from a producer side, and then also from a buyer side, and from a project developer side. So one of sort of the key things to understand about carbon credits and carbon projects is that, there's this sort of high technical barrier to participation. And so a carbon project is going to require a landowner to do a new practice, something they haven't been doing previously. And that's essential to sort of generating the climate benefit that a buyer is going to want to pay for at the end of the day. So practices need to be new, and they need to be sort of sustained then once they're implemented over time, to ensure that sort of regular payment that comes. And that's a unique thing in the carbon world, is that it's payment for outcomes and not necessarily payment for performance in a lot of cases. So there's a lot to consider. There's also sort of like the duration of agreements that some the projects are required to sort of have. And again, that comes back to sort of these requirements that a lot of carbon standards have. And so what that means for producers, that you might be asked to sign a contract to commit to practices for 10 years, for 20 years, for 40 years. It sort of depends on the individual developer and how they want to sort of manage the risk and work to co-manage the risk of the project with the producer. There's a lot of questions. I understand the skepticism. If I were a producer myself, I would be asking a lot of questions to each engagement. And that said, I think the market is improving. We are seeing sort of the bad actors, or the ingenuine actors, sort of start to fall out, and the cream rise to the top, if you will. And so, it's growing pains to some extent. Sure. And we also, are very excited about the potential for further growth in the market.
That's cool. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And maybe one thing to add is that as the Nature Conservancy, we don't actually have any carbon credit projects in Nebraska. So we're not implementing any projects that would be generating carbon credits. We do have kind of a pilot, what we're calling a Scope 3 project, called the Nebraska Soil Carbon Project, that was started in 2020. And the Nebraska Agriculture Director, Jacob Fritton, has been working with quite a few producers across Nebraska. And I think a large part of that project has been like teasing apart what makes sense for your operation, who is approaching you about the carbon market, and kind of offering some of this, like, we're operating as kind of a neutral party in Nebraska. So like if you have questions, I don't want to say you can reach out to Jacob, but we're definitely like thinking about what it looks like to implement new practices. The Nebraska Soil Carbon Project is a regional conservation partnership program, and RCPP is working with NRCS, really designed to think about like what practices make sense for the producers that are in that region of Nebraska. And then how can we start to think about quantifying outcomes? Again, that's not generating carbon credits. The idea is that that would be generating outcomes for companies that are within a company's value chain.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought that up, Gabriella, because I was going to mention it here. I think Jacob and Nick have really done a good job saying, hey, this is a nice, easy way to learn about just carbon in general, and then practices that you can implement and then get X, Y, and Z out of them. So they've done a really good job. They've been completely open and transparent with producers to really make them feel better about looking into some sort of a program. So they've done a really good job. And I think that's important because it really drills down to the people that matter when we talk carbon, at least at a field by field basis. Without producers, we don't have any sort of carbon credits to sell at the end of the day. So why does a lot of the conversation about carbon credit and carbon credit creation center around agriculture and ag systems?
So I think it's the circles that you sort of live and work in. And so in a state like Nebraska and in a state like Kansas, where I am too, that's the predominant land use. And so that's where a lot of the conversation around carbon is. There's also a huge industry and marketplace around forest carbon. That's sort of where carbon first came onto the scene, really, is, let's stop cutting down the Amazon and generate a carbon credit through that avoided deforestation, basically. So there are very different carbon project types suited to sort of the landscape and the context all around the world. And that sort of goes back to this idea of natural climate solutions, is that, there are management decisions that we can make in any landscape to improve and enhance the carbon storage potential of that landscape or reduce the carbon emissions from that landscape. In a place like Nebraska, depending on if you're talking a crop field or a grassland, a prairie, there might be different approaches that you could take. In croplands, we see sort of more of the classic cover crops tillage as these reduced tillage as these activities that can enhance carbon storage and potentially generate carbon credits. On a grassland system, there's a couple of different pathways you might be able to take. There's improved grazing management, which, there's a mixed body of literature and some evidence in some cases that, by doing more of this rotational grazing, you can store soil carbon. That doesn't work in every circumstance, but in some cases it does. But then the other sort of thing that you see for carbon in grassland rangeland systems is this idea, again, of avoided conversion. When properties come up for sale, if they can be purchased and put into a conservation easement, a lot of times that's something that can be registered as a carbon benefit and generate carbon credits to avoid that conversion of grassland into cropland that would release carbon into the atmosphere.
I'm happy you brought up the perennial side of things because, again, here in Nebraska or probably even Kansas, a bulk of what we hear about is just strictly for row crop acres. And I've actually always wondered, why are we not promoting, enrolling acres back into perennial habitat that are really low yielding or really shouldn't be farmed for whatever reason? And I've always asked those questions, but I don't feel like I've ever really got a good answer as to why we're not going that route, at least here in Nebraska.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of that too, personally. I don't know if I'll be able to give you a great answer. I think, yeah, you're right. The carbon benefit there is obvious, right? It's putting marginal land back into grass cover, perennial grass cover that would, store and enhance carbon over time. I think it takes the right developer to sort of see that opportunity and go for it. And, carbon being as new as it is, A lot of the sort of initial players are either looking at conserving existing grasslands, or they might be these larger food and beverage companies who want to do something with producers while still, maintaining production on that land. And so, this is sort of like that middle ground. It's like a CRP model, but for carbon, basically. So,
Sure.
I would love to see more of that. I think, there has the potential for that to become more of a common practice. We've talked about this idea at a high level as the Nature Conservancy, but haven't put anything forward just yet. But in a future where CRP, the CRP program shrinks and there's less money available through that, you might be able to see something like a carbon project as a way to step up and finance that kind of habitat restoration work.
Absolutely. And being in the precision ag space, I think there's a lot of potential there, because when I'm working with growers, I don't want to remove their whole field from production by any means, right? Say there's only, 2, 3, 4, 5%, maybe prairie strips is a good practice, or pollinator corner or something like that. But when you're enrolling that small amount of acres into a perennial program, you're getting more benefits than just the upfront of reduced inputs, fertilizers, fossil fuels, and things like that. Like you mentioned, you have that long-term carbon storage as well. So I just see a lot of those factors compounding for maximized benefits.
Yeah. And the other challenge there, to be honest, is the economy of scale. When we're talking about small chunks of land that would have a carbon benefit associated with them. So, the current price of carbon, it depends on the project, but, it's anywhere from $15, $20, $30 a ton. You might expect 1 ton, 1.5, let's say, per acre for something like putting land back into perennial grass cover. And so, the math doesn't add up for a small scale, at least. And so, again, that's going to take that sort of developer and aggregator to look at aggregating, big pieces, or aggregating many small pieces of land across the landscape to make something make sense and make it viable in the market. We've seen a similar sort of model work here at TNC on the forestry side of things. So TNC is the supporter of a program called the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is in the eastern U.S. It covers some 15 states or so. And basically what that program does is works in partnership with the American Forest Foundation to bring carbon finance to small private landowners, I think with sometimes as few as 30 acres. I might get that wrong, but it's focused on landowners who have small tracts of land, but still want to do some sort of improved management. And have historically been unable to participate in the carbon market because of this sort of issue of an economy of scale. So we're starting to figure that out as TNC. It's started in the forest world, kind of like the carbon world more generally. But, there's an exciting opportunity to learn from that model, I think, and take and adapt it to something that's more relevant to this part of the world.
So when you mentioned 1 ton of carbon per acre, was that on a per year basis for perennial habitat establishment, or is that just 1 ton of carbon and you're done?
Yeah, it depends on the practice. It's certainly not just 1 year and you're done. You get credit for every additional ton of carbon that you accrue. So, for something like planting a marginal strip back into perennial vegetation cover, I'm not exactly sure how long you could expect to sequester carbon to get a payment for that. It's certainly more than 1 year. In this case, it's probably more than 10 or 20 years as well. And so there's the potential for those longer term revenue streams through that kind of a practice. Other practices might not have that kind of extended benefit as well. They might be a bit more sort of as you implement the practice, but not all of them.
That's interesting. So from a producer angle, thinking about carbon markets, certainty is pretty important to them and making decisions, and so because this is still kind of an evolving process, for any of the producers that are listening out there, what are kind of your thoughts on and kind of what the TNC's involvement for like next steps and kind of helping them think through this of, kind of maybe where they can go find resources or just other things that can maybe help them, figure out, some certainty if this is kind of an angle that they want to pursue for their operation?
Yeah, I'd love to hear Gabriella's take on this too, but I would just say it's important to read the fine print and understand who bears the risk.
Okay.
I think a lot of these carbon projects and carbon developers, are doing a good job and willing to bear a lot of the risk themselves. And so it's important to find a developer where that's the case, or a project where that's the case. Obviously, nobody wants to bear sort of the entire risk of a carbon project themselves, but
Sure.
look for those projects where you feel like it's sort of an equal partnership, sort of an exploration, because they do exist, and there are good terms and good deals to be had. Not all cases, but in some certainly.
Yeah, I would just echo what Jacob said. Reading your contract is always paramount. But I think when we talk about producer-facing resources, that TNC, like on our website, has some very accessible materials that explain kind of the basics of the carbon market. So I think understanding broadly how the carbon market works is definitely useful for producers. I would also say plug for the Soil Carbon Solution Center at CSU. They've done some really interesting work on kind of synthesizing some existing resources. What are kind of the 101s that producers need to know? And, they're a research university, so they're always happy to chat through what that looks like for a producer. But yeah, I think just understanding what you're signing up for, making sure you feel confident with the partnership is definitely kind of the best advice that we can give.
That's good.
Yeah, great advice.
Too good to be true. It probably is.
No, it's good.
Yeah, that's important for our listeners to hear. And I want to make one comment before we kind of switch gears here from the carbon credit to more of the emissions and supply chain side of things. I know we're not going to solve the economy of scale issue like you mentioned, but when it comes to talking like $20 and $30 an acre, especially on those small projects, that can go a long way when we're implementing practices on the landscape, right? Because we have incentives across Nebraska, and I'm sure other states do, that it might only be a $10, $15, $20 incentive to get perennial habitat out there on the ground. So I hope somebody's looking at it and trying to figure out a way to aggregate that data, because I really think it could be beneficial long term, but I understand the trouble.
And I'll add to that. I think that also speaks to these kind of the idea of stackable enterprises. So it's a producer thinking about, they have their base income, so if, say, their row crop production, thinking about other innovative ways to optimize their farm's profitability, and doing that, through potential stackable programs that are out there, ways they can kind of work together with, TNC or state agencies or federal agencies or whatever, whoever that may be, to think about opportunities where they could, integrate multiple options to create kind of what I like to always envision is like these holistic operations or holistic farms or ranches that are really able to optimize these systems most efficiently. In the era of AI, I think we have huge opportunities there to really, leverage a lot of those powers to be really strategic and think about that scalability. So yeah, I think there's some really innovative ways to kind of scale that up. It's just a matter, like you said, thinking through that process and kind of having the right people to put in place to help that. So
switching gears here, I think we've kind of mentioned it, a carbon footprint, but can we go ahead and just put a definition on that for our listeners? And then how do we determine what a carbon footprint is for a company?
Definitely. This is what I spend, I would say, the majority of my time thinking about. And I don't necessarily think that this changes what on the ground implementation looks like if we think about this from like a company perspective versus if we think about this from generating a carbon offset perspective. But when we're talking about a carbon footprint, that term actually came from BP. So it's like an oil company term, and was a way for BP to essentially get consumers and get the regular average everyday person thinking about the emissions that they're contributing to the atmosphere. So you'll often see these like tools that are like, insert how many light bulbs you have in your house, and it'll give you like you took 10 flights this year. This is your carbon footprint for the year. Not that that's not an important part. I think, all of us are responsible for our own emissions, but that's not really the language that we see companies using. We usually see companies across, so not just talking about agriculture companies, but also talking about like if you're a manufacturing company, if you're a cement company, if you're a car manufacturer. We see this framing of scopes 1, 2, and 3, and you're talking about an emissions inventory, not a footprint. So you can think about it as like I'm calculating all of my emissions that have happened in a given year using these 3 categories of scopes. So scope 1 is your owned and operated emissions. So these are direct emissions from assets that you own. So if I'm a consumer packaged good company and I'm packaging, let's say, my yogurt, it's like the emissions going into packaging my yogurt. So that's like the actual container, how many emissions it took to create that container. Then we have scope 2, which is emissions from purchased electricity. That's just directly purchasing electricity from the grid. That's considered an indirect emission because I don't own and operate whatever municipality or power generator is creating that electricity. And then I think the most important category to think about for the agri-food value chain is scope 3. So that's any emissions coming from your value chain that you don't own and operate. And when we think about companies who are purchasing agriculture goods, who are purchasing forestry products, that's usually upwards of 90% of their emissions are coming from scope 3. And that's also the emissions that they have the least control and traceability over. So I don't think that's like necessarily, if you want to spend time thinking about scope 1 through scope 3, I don't think that actually changes what implementation and what the science says we need to do in order to address climate change. That's just the framing that we see companies using. And that's like a pretty well-established framing. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol adapted this. They've been around for, upwards of 30 years, I think, at this point. And they've done some talking about standards. They have a whole suite of standards that companies are using to think about their supply chains and measuring and accounting for their emissions.
That's really cool.
Well, and I like the different levels of it because it breaks it down, makes it easy for me to understand, right? So like scope 1 is directly what they're doing, and then you just go down the list as opposed to just saying emissions or something like that. It'd be pretty arbitrary.
Right. Or it's
point.
like their carbon footprint is just like everything at that point, right?
Sure.
Like breaking it out into the scopes makes it really tractable. And then you can kind of assign responsibility through like by using that framework.
So how are companies going in and assessing these different levels or scopes, and then do they assess them each year, or is it more just they set a goal and then they're assessing them over a number of years?
Great question. So at this point, we do see companies assessing their emissions on an annual basis. And I think important caveat, most of the companies that are doing this right now, they're doing this voluntarily. So like all of these standards are voluntary. It is to like better understand their supply chain. It is really investing in like the supply chain resilience that Jacob and I keep talking about. But we see them using emissions factors in activity data. So I think the simplest way I can put this is like, usually there's a consultant who has a large database. So if I'm purchasing, for example, cornmeal, and I know that I've purchased 1,000 tons of that, they'll have an emissions factor that says for every 1,000 tons of cornmeal, this is the CO2 equivalents associated with it. So every 1 ton of cornmeal equals 10 metric tons of CO2. I multiply that and I get a large number. Some companies really struggle with getting that data. So we also see inventories that are not just based on what we call activity data, so the actual purchasing of the cornmeal, but it'll actually be an emissions factor associated with like the dollar amount. So last year, I spent $2,000 on cornmeal. This is what this database is telling me the emissions factor is, and that's how I'm calculating my inventory. As you can imagine, the larger the company and the more complex the supply chain, this gets incredibly data intensive. And quite frankly, we don't have the appropriate data systems in place to go from on farm, and we don't have the traceability either. We don't have the ability to go from on farm all the way to like the cereal that cornmeal is going into, and being able to really accurately say like, this corn that was grown on this farm equals this amount of emissions. It got turned into cornmeal. It got turned into cereal. And at the end of the day, this is how the company can account for it. we're working on that. But I think at this point, the emissions factor and activity data is kind of the system that the companies are using right now while they invest in better traceability and while they invest in better data.
That's really cool.
It's kind of that old adage, right? Like you can only manage what you can measure.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of companies are really trying to figure this out for the first time.
Yeah.
So back to that, when companies start to measure their emissions across their different scopes, is there a particular scope that they start at? So you said that scope 1 is their direct emissions, so they have direct control over that, right? But 90% of their emissions come from scope 3. So where does a company start most often?
Great question. Typically, we always see companies starting with scope 1 because they have the best data. So if you see a company, if you go back like 10 years, their first inventory is usually just their direct emissions. And as they start to understand, as they start to get staff who is more skilled in like understanding inventorying and emissions, you'll see them expand. For these larger these larger global companies, oftentimes they'll publish their inventory. So it's pretty cool if you can like go to like Nestle's website or General Mills website, you can see like the emissions breakdown, and the larger companies who are really thinking about sustainability and thinking about their supply chains are like publishing the high level information of like where their emissions are coming from. But yeah, mostly companies who are starting off early, and even smaller companies who are never going to invest in their scope 3 are focusing on scope 1 and 2.
I noticed, I was looking at some flights the other day on Google Flights, and I noticed that they actually have that on there. You can pick different flights based on that was kind of interesting. I hadn't seen that before. So.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point too. It gets to kind of like this idea of back to like the consumer responsibility piece, like how responsible are we as consumers of these products and goods, of like, is it my responsibility to purchase a less emitting flight, or is it Delta's responsibility like to invest in the supply chain and invest into sustainable aviation fuel? So I think that's something that I think a lot about personally.
Oh, sure.
And then I think one other thing on like the scopes 1, 2, and 3 that gets a little quirky is like so if I'm thinking about an on-farm operation, I'm thinking about if I'm a farmer, my direct operations, those are my scope 1, right? But farmers are never going to like have a greenhouse gas inventory, nor do they need to have that. But if I'm thinking about my direct operations, that's my scope 1, but that's General Mills or Nestle or insert anyone along the agri-food value chain. That's their scope 3. I think sometimes people are like, is this double counting? No, it's just like a weird accounting way that we use this frameworks of scopes 1 and scopes 2 and scope 3. So there's no double counting. It's just like depending on your position in the value chain, that changes what emissions are categorized in which scope.
Sure. Yeah. So it seems like into the future, it's going to be the next 5, 10, 15 plus years. Things are really going to evolve quite a bit to be able to start, analyzing and capitalizing on these different components along that supply chain, just to really better quantify, is what I guess I'm trying to get at, the potential impacts along the way.
For the large scale companies that you mentioned that are probably national type companies, you mentioned that they're doing all of their counting and everything here voluntarily. Are they doing that here because they're already having to do it for the EU, or to be able to sell their product in the EU?
I would say in the future, that might be why some companies are doing that. I think it's really to understand like their supply chain better. So when we think about making progress, and it's also back to this idea of like social license to operate. If I'm doing nothing to address my emissions, at some point, companies are thinking consumers are going to be less interested in purchasing my product versus purchasing the product of one of my competitors. I would say that companies are using this as like a tool to better understand their supply chain, understand their risk, and then also decide where they want to focus implementation. So if I know that the majority of my emissions are coming from corn and soy, and I'm sourcing that from Nebraska and Kansas, it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to go and invest in a program focused on livestock in Brazil. So we're also seeing it as a tool for when companies have a limited budget to invest in sustainability, they're really using like this emissions inventory to like focus where they're doing their implementation.
And that's exciting for me to hear, because a lot of the times you hear producers talk like the dollars really don't get back to me, right? I'm selling whatever my product is at this price, and it goes on and becomes something else for a greater amount, but I'm only seeing change here. So when you say that companies are really trying to focus on their own supply chains all the way down to the field level, the field level and the producer, that's really exciting.
Sure.
And producers should be excited about that, in my opinion.
Yeah, it sort of gets to this whole idea of traceability, which, like Gabriella was talking about earlier, has been a big challenge for some companies. You know, you think about like General Millses of the world who aren't who are really invested in sort of understanding their footprint and their emissions, but don't necessarily have a direct relationship with producers in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so cracking that nut of really understanding, like, okay, which fields, which producers am I getting my oats from that are growing them, you know, using regenerative agriculture, using cover crops or reduced tillage. Like, that's the kind of question that a lot of these companies are really trying to solve if they don't already have that pre-existing relationship. And yeah, you know, it represents a significant investment that, you know, we hope as the Nature Conservancy does return even more value to producers.
Well, and yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I'm excited that companies are doing this, but at the same time, I mean, it's a difficult task for them, right? Because you have all these producers out there in the countryside. They harvest their crops. They maybe put multiple fields into multiple trucks, take them to the elevator, then where it gets mixed in a large elevator and then gets put on how many train cars and shipped wherever. So, yeah, to your point, it's definitely a difficult issue to address.
It's the kind of thing too, where I think back sort of towards this idea of advice that we can give folks, you know, and of only being able to manage what you can measure. I think we're seeing this sort of growth in areas of ag tech and data management and data collection for individual farms. And so farms and producers that have the time to sort of understand and explore some of these different options are going to have a leg up when they do find an opportunity to participate in a carbon market or in a supply chain program that they're excited about. So, you know, this idea of being able to track and monitor on which field have I done which practice, and, you know, how much crop did I get out of that? Like, it's those sort of practices and that idea of being able to track what you're doing that these companies are going to find very valuable,
Sure.
And already do find valuable. And so it pays to have those sort of good data skills and tech skills too, to be quite honest, to engage with some of the platforms and companies and middlemen sometimes that you see offering these sort of technology solutions and data products.
Yeah, good point. Good. And not that farmers don't already have a million things to do, but collect as much data as possible, even if you don't think it's worth it right now, because who knows down the road.
Exactly.
With that and decarbonization in companies, can we expect companies to ever be to net zero carbon emissions? And then what does that mean?
Great question. I think I'll start with, what does net zero mean for companies? Sure. So going back to this idea that Jacob has already talked about, like reducing your own value chain emissions. So reaching net zero as a company, reducing their within value chain emissions, so things within their scope 1, within their scope 2, and within their scope 3 as much as possible. And then with what's left, they're able to use carbon credits that are happening outside, that have been generated outside of their value chain, to neutralize those remaining emissions on a time frame of 2050. Most of this thinking comes from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is like the voluntary framework we see companies using to set their net zero targets. If anyone Googles the Science-Based Targets Initiative, there's a lot of reports saying that the achievability of these targets is not possible. There's a lot of surveys out there surveying different companies within different industries, especially food and beverage companies, that net zero is not possible and companies are off track already. I think at TNC, we don't want to see like a mass abandonment of these targets. I think what we're really doing is to like, how can we make the system and these targets workable? And right now what that means is like an outsized role for carbon credits. So if I'm a company and I'm off track because it's too expensive, I don't have the traceability within my own supply chain to address those scope 3 emissions that are making up most of my emissions. Can I purchase carbon credits and drive finance to a really important biodiversity, ecologically important area while I invest in these systems of traceability, while I invest in better data collection to ultimately get back on track? But yeah, to answer your question, no, companies are not on track, and it's possible that like they won't be on track. A lot of these targets are set with like a 2030 short-term target. 2030 is really close, so we'll see, in the next 5 years. But at TNC, we really want companies to continue to invest in this, continue to work with their supply chains, continue to support growers, even if that means that they're not on track for net zero right now. It doesn't mean just like throw up your hands and walk away from this entire thing. I think we really want to build like a credible system that's able to track this. But if you're not on track right now, it just means continue working.
So it's also kind of like you can constantly course correct. So you have kind of a lofty goal and you're constantly making changes to say, this is our, long-term goal, but it may just take time to get there, but we're going to constantly course correct to continue to improve over the long haul per se.
And from the climate's perspective, every degree matters. We set these goals through the Paris Agreement of, 1.5 degrees of warming by 2030, I think it is. But in reality, like every degree that we mitigate is, a less risky future that we have to endure. And so, yeah, like this is really sort of core to TNC's work here is that, we don't want perfect to be the enemy of good.
Sure.
Every degree matters. Every positive action matters. Every dollar that's invested in climate resilience and supply chain resilience matters.
Without a doubt. And yeah, I'm an optimist. I'm in the camp of, I'm happy they haven't reached their goals yet, because if they reach these goals in half the time, it'd be like, maybe your goal should have been a little higher.
Yeah.
So
exactly. There you go.
Yeah. Go back, reassess if it doesn't work out, and go from there. With that, do you guys have any other information that you'd like to get out to growers or resource professionals?
I think if anyone wants to take a look at the Nature Conservancy's website, our website is nature.org. We have some really important information on how organizationally we're thinking about climate, how we're thinking about biodiversity, and how we're thinking about water. And then some of the other resources that I mentioned are the frameworks. If you want to look up Science-Based Targets Initiative, I don't think this is like somewhere that growers need to spend a lot of their time thinking about how companies are measuring their emissions. But if you're extra nerdy and extra curious, but I think, I guess just like parting words, I really want to just harp on this idea that we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good. And as TNC, we're participating in these standards bodies in how we're developing these protocols, both on the carbon market side and on the within value chain side, to make sure that they're credible, scientifically robust, but they're ultimately achievable and actionable for producers and companies.
Yeah, I mean, I just say, every state in the U.S. has a TNC chapter, and so they're going to be a great resource just for sort of the local understanding, the local context of carbon and what that means. We, as sort of these larger global teams, are also regularly in contact with them, and so, it's good to ask questions and read the fine print. It's an emerging space. It's an exciting space too. I think we think that there's a lot of potential for growth, and there's continued demand from the market, from a lot of these large companies. And so it's an exciting space to watch. If you don't sort of like the deal that you see right now, perfectly fine to wait and hope that a better one comes along, because I do think the market's going to continue to grow. There's going to continue to be more opportunities to add value to the individual operations through carbon and climate efforts.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I think it's also really setting this episode up is thinking about, maybe a few years down the road, we can kind of come back and revisit some of these topics and think about like, how have things evolved over time? Or is there more certainty? And like you said, it's just a lot of things that are constantly changing with every day and are improving, and the opportunities there for producers to think a little differently about maybe some of their operation and what ways they can create kind of stackable enterprises on their own property. And so I think it's cool. I think it's a really innovative way to think about something a little different that maybe it's haven't really thought about in the past. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, without a doubt. Thanks for not only coming on today, but again, like Andy said, for all the work that you and your teams do, because I really do think in the future that carbon credits could really play a huge role in getting more conservation efforts out there on the landscape. So Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We appreciate the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.